Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm the host, Sean Boyce. I'd like to welcome my guest to the show today, Ben Whately, who is the founder of Memrise and is also an angel investor. Hello, Ben. How are you? And thanks for being on the show.
Very good, thanks. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, very excited to talk more. We've had your CEO, Steve, on the show to talk more about his work with Memrise. I'm a big fan of the app myself. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you yet or not, but I've used it quite a bit as I've continued to learn languages myself and found it very helpful. My teachers are also very big fans. So you've got a lot of fans on this side, first and foremost. But what I'd love to hear from you before we kind of dive in and talk more about your story is a little bit more about your background. So if you wouldn't mind, please share for our audience.
Sure thing. So I guess a slightly circuitous route to getting into starting a language learning business. I mean, I always struggled with learning languages at school. I did fine in exams, but I knew I couldn't speak French. I knew I couldn't speak Spanish. I knew I couldn't speak Latin, Greek, ancient Greek. So there was this sort of disconnect between the fact that I could do the exams, but I just knew I couldn't actually speak the language. And I then separately, I got very into creating neural networks. I was trying to model the outcome of horse races. I'm convinced that if I could use the pattern recognition of a neural network to spot things that the bookmakers weren't spotting. This is my teenage geek. And through doing that, I actually never got very good at predicting the results of horse races. But I did get really interested in the way that neural networks are structured and ended up going to Oxford to study neuroscience as a result. And while I was studying that, I then got into more generally how neural networks learn and therefore how the human brain learns. So I kind of came at human psychology from the computer angle rather than the other way around, which was quite unusual at the time. And one of the things that struck me then was that the human brain learns by experience, not by being set rules. And it's kind of the difference between a computer program where you tell it what it should be doing and generative AI, LLMs, which are just spotting patterns in the data, and you don't know why it's come up with that result, but that's how it's worked. And human brains learn more like that. They learn by spotting patterns in what happens. And yet the way I'd been taught languages was by this application of rules. Like, do this, take a word, change the ending in this way in order to infer that meaning. And it's like, that's not how our brains work. And that's, in fact, why it's really hard to learn languages that way, is because that's just not how our brains work. And you can't program a human brain to work that way. You can intellectually, it's how the kind of intellectual side, reasoning side of our brain works. And you can learn that intellectually. That can be a prop that helps you when you're going to practice the language. But you don't need it. It's neither necessary nor sufficient. And you kind of see that because we all know that children don't learn languages by being taught rules. We all know, I mean, maybe not all of us know, but certainly when I was at Oxford, I knew all the classics scholars who were studying ancient Latin and Greek. They knew all the grammar rules. They just couldn't speak a word of it out loud. They couldn't speak a single sentence. And so these two things are clearly separate and not interrelated. And yet we persist in thinking that the way we teach a language and the way we learn a language is through these rules. It feels like that's what we think we should be doing. Anyway, so I got into that through neuroscience. Then after I graduated, I wanted to see if this was really true in practice. So I moved to the northeast corner of China, the little bit that goes up on the right-hand side up towards Siberia. And I went to live in a town called Qiqihar, where I decided to see if I could learn Chinese if I was just surrounded by people speaking Chinese. And it turned out that I could. Pretty quickly, I could speak enough Chinese. As someone who had totally failed in all my language learning endeavors to that point, and Chinese was meant to be a hard language, and in a few months, I was perfectly capable of conducting a social life. Within a year, I had a business in the language where everyone I worked with only spoke Chinese. So then I spent a few more years in China doing things like motorcycle factories, shirt factories, and various other early business escapades. And then I moved back to the UK, where we started Memrise. And really, I initially was starting something to just bring that kind of language learning through experience to a wider audience. I didn't want everyone to go and live in Chichihar. It was actually the reason I chose, one of the reasons I chose Chichihar is that there's a guidebook called The Rough Guide. And I was looking through, northeastern China has a very pure Chinese accent. So I thought I wanted to be in that area. And I was looking through the rough guide through cities in northeastern China. And for Chichihar, a city of 3.5 million people, it had basically one sentence that just said, "It's more fun to say the name of this city out loud than to spend more than an hour there." And I was just like, this is 3.5 million people's home. You cannot dismiss it like that. I'm going to go and live there just to show you. I mean, it turns out tourist attractions are quite light in Chichihar, but it was a very nice place. Very cold, but very nice. Totally lost my train of thought. What was I talking about?
It's fascinating. I think what I'm taking away so far about your experience, which is super interesting, is that this pattern, which I've seen elsewhere with those that have been successful in building software companies, is often related to kind of solving their own problem. So it looks like you found a gap in the market in terms of how people were trying to solve a big problem that was largely less effective. The whole like trying to learn a language based on rules. And I can speak from a technical experience myself because I'm an engineer and just have to learn things that way because I've learned a lot of technical things in that way. And then I've been studying languages for years and it's completely different. So is the approach, especially nowadays. And I've learned a lot because of the way your technology works. But it sounds like having lived the experience, part of it was wanting to solve the problem yourself or further explore where the opportunity was in that space. Was that part of kind of what inspired how you created Memrise? And then either way, let me know. But what did traction look like from there? So once you started working on it, what did scaling that look like?
Yeah, so yes, it was totally from solving the problem that I had myself and seeing that there wasn't really. And I guess it also felt like there was something pretty exciting going on in neural networks that was helping to change the mental model of how our brains work. And I think it's been a long-standing feature of humanity that we tend to use metaphors of our best technology to try and understand how we work. And how we work and our experience of being alive and being humans is so, if you look back in Buddhist philosophy or any ancient philosophy, that it's just explored internally from the lived experience of being a human and how does that feel. And then you have these incredible metaphoric drawings and visualizations of experience. But then kind of since the Industrial Revolution, I think, and by the way, this is personal conjecture, this is not anything that would stand up to academic rigor. But I observe that people start to, as we start to get good at building machines externally, we'd be like, that works like clockwork. And I kind of see how the world, I can think of one thing impacting another is kind of like what I did with that clock. And you can look at a clockwork mechanism and kind of understand what's going on, and then use that as a metaphor for understanding how other things interact in the world, which is grossly simplified for most of nature, but gives you a kind of illusion of being able to reason how these different parts interact. And then as we have computers as a metaphor for how we think and how we remember. And you kind of see that when people are thinking about remembering things. You think of like with retrieving a file, which is not how our brain works. It's a distributed network and a firing pattern across billions of neurons. It's totally different. But we're using that metaphor. And I think there was something that I was just really excited by, the idea that by making these more almost more mechanistic models of the brain, we were starting to get a different way of thinking about the brain. And I was kind of excited by that metaphor, really. So I'm going to just keep going off on wandering tangents that have to bring me back to the subject. So your question was, how did that then get into traction? So I had this idea and I had this experience, and then we're like, well, what slice of that can we cut down to become an actual product? And that's where I teamed up with Ed and Greg, who were so Ed is a grandmaster of memory. Greg had studied neuroscience with me in the same college at Oxford, but had now gone on to do a PhD at Princeton in memory formation. And so they were very focused on how do we help people use their memories more effectively, which is a big part of learning a language. Learning is memory. And so we got together. They were already building this kind of memorization platform, and we realized actually this could be a basis. We can start with the memorization of words, and then we can build onto it all of these other aspects that we want to do that are much more to do with the experience of trying to understand people and the experience of practicing speaking. So our first step was like, what is the MVP here? And we scoped it back to learning words and phrases, ideally in context. So we started that, and I think the real traction, so we spent a couple of years on web with that, building that as a website. That was probably our biggest mistake early on, was that we didn't just launch on mobile. And this is quite a sort of depressing fact of what actually leads, or in our case, has led to growth. And I do see this quite often, that you want your growth to come from a genius viral feature that you've come up with, or some mechanic, and you've done the Reforge growth program, and you know how to draw your growth loop and get something that is mutually reinforcing, and it's this great intellectual task. Like, the reason that we unlocked growth was that we got onto mobile early enough that there were only 2 or 3 other mobile language learning apps. Apple and Google have to keep featuring different ones. We got on there early enough that we got big featuring early. We then got really good at working with Google and really understanding how to give the Google team the information that they want. Google is so metrics driven that the more you can show them how they are building things that are helping you to grow your business, the more the internal team in Google can show off to their bosses, hey, look, this is how we work. Look at the great impact we had. And that allows you to get more visibility. Everyone in Google knows you get more featuring, and it's this snowball. And it's kind of disappointing, but that was really our big thing. Our big mistake was that Duolingo had been out for 2 years already by the time we launched. And Duolingo was really first out on mobile, and had 2 years before anybody else really caught them. I think Rosetta Stone got out, but it was such a rubbish app that it didn't really matter that anybody else doing it competently caught up with them. And yeah, that was really massive growth factor. So getting out on mobile early enough, and where there's a big platform shift, and you see it right now with AI startups that is totally turning everything on its head, that the people who got to AI first are able to get a huge, surf that wave. And I think these platform shifts are just such a big moment of potential.
Well said. Yeah, it's super interesting. Thank you for breaking that down. Curious also to learn more about, I think, let me know if this is the current number at the moment, but on your website, it says 65 million users, which is obviously a very impressive number. Curious to learn more about what it takes to reach a level like that, and maybe what the levels look like.
That's a depressingly undynamic number. I think it's about 72, 73 now. So we built the homepage in HubSpot for reasons of allowing the team to test it really quickly, but it does mean that because the growth team don't have the developers in there, it isn't hooked up to all the APIs in the way that it might be. Anyway, so I mean, getting to scale like that. First of all, I mean, many people say this, but it warrants repeating that you have to design so much with growth in mind. And although you're right that solving your own problems is a really important, overwhelming motivator and kind of starting point, you can't keep trying to solve your own problems, because very quickly solving your own problems becomes doing the thing that I think is cool, which doesn't get to good product.
Everyone, right?
And so the so the discipline needed there to just keep understanding what is actually going to grow with your users, what is going to be a massive step change. And I guess actually let's skip forward slightly to that. So skipping over, you get to growth by solving someone's problem really clearly, but also by having growth channels that you can go through. So for us, the big growth channel was getting in the app stores early enough, and then SEO taking over later on. We've never been able to compete with Duolingo or Babbel on marketing spend. They spend tens, hundreds of millions. I think our marketing spend last month was probably like $4,000. Like, we just don't spend money on it. It's all organic. But you reach a point where we're like, we've got two massive gorillas in the room in Duolingo and Babbel who are spending a huge amount and getting massive traction on that. It sucks a lot of the air out of the room. And whereas when we started, there was quite a lot of differentiation in terms of the memorization product that we'd made versus the kind of course, the translation product that Duolingo had. But over time, that delta got smaller and smaller. And at the same time, we had struggled to make the changes. Like, as I said, the original impetus for me in setting up this company was to make these like immersive experiences like I'd had in Northern China. But that's not a memorization product. But we'd really struggled when we tried to implement those. We tried to get a massive amount of video into the product, but actually streaming video on mobile in 2014 wasn't very good. When we first started trying to do it in 2012, it really wasn't good at all. And it took a long time for that to really grow up. This is a time before Instagram video, before even Vine came out quite late into it, and that was a bit of a change. But so we reached a point in like 2018 where we hadn't managed to land those products, and the delta between the quality of what you got on Memrise and what you got on Duolingo was not huge, and pretty much vanished. And at that point, when you look at it from a traditional product development standpoint, it's like, well, to our users, what do they want? Well, they wanted kind of more features around a memorization app. And that's troublesome, because we look at a memorization app and you're like, well, what is this? A very high value product? Like, is this actually going to help people get where we want to get people? What can we do there? I mean, flashcards, Quizlet, again, was there a lot before us, had huge traction before we even started, and kind of does the flashcard thing. But also they have the problem that outside the US and a little bit the UK, flashcards aren't really a thing. Flashcards is a US concept. And so they struggle with international expansion. So we had this difficult strategic problem that what our immediate users were telling us to do in the sort of traditional product development sense was not what we believed would actually lead to growth. Meanwhile, we had a long-term company vision sitting on the shelf there. We want to give people these immersive experiences, but we haven't actually delivered on that yet. So how do we manage that? And I guess I actually now see this a lot in companies I advise, where you're trying to get this balance between really good product and growth thinking, where you're talking to your users all the time, you're understanding what it is they want, you're testing things really, really quickly, particularly growth experiments have to be super fast. You want to be doing 5 iterations a week and getting them out. With this idea of, we've actually got to build something that's quite fundamentally different. And you got the Henry Ford quote of like, if I'd asked my customers, they'd have said they wanted faster horses. And how do you marry these like sort of founder level insights of we've got to build something different with good product development of we've got to ask people what they want, otherwise we're just going to build something no one wants. Which is it's a very hard balance to get right.
Definitely. I think you've
If I dive more
articulated
into that, I'm kind of
particularly well that one. I would love to hear more about your thoughts in terms of how you strike that balance, because I've even heard different interpretations of that quote, and you're right, that comes up all the time. But
interesting.
yeah,
What other interpretations have you heard of that?
So from my perspective, in terms of the whole, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. I think the interpretation of the faster horses comes from interpreting what the users are saying by focusing on the wrong aspect of what they're saying. I think often the focus goes on the horse. Like I want you to do something to my horse that can't be done. I think to me, the change that they're looking for is like they want to get around from point A to point B more efficiently. So they want to get there faster. So I would focus instead on the fast, as in, I think our jobs potentially as founders and CEOs, I'm curious for your take on this too, is like, I need to find a way to get people from point A to point B faster. And if I can do that, they'll jump on it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a car. Like it could be whatever.
I think that's 100% right. I think if you should, maybe the follow-up quote is like, Henry, if you tried to breed a faster horse as a result of that, you'd have been guilty of crap user interviews. And so the point is, and I do think that this is one of the key skills for founders and for founders in particular, is being really good at customer development interviews and understanding. Essentially, when you're setting up a company and when you're dreaming up a new product, we have a cultural idea that people have a business idea. I don't think a business idea means anything or not anything helpful. I think you can have a customer insight idea, and how good your business ends up being is a direct function of the quality of your customer insight. And the very best customer insights come when circumstances are changing. And that you've got an insight, like there's a new customer insight that is just developing and is going to be huge. And I'm early into identifying this customer insight appearing. And I guess for us at Memrise, we were too early on our customer insight, which was mobile phones offer an ability to create an immersive learning experience without you having to go and live in northern China. And we were too early on that because actually the technology wasn't there yet. Took bloody ages for the technology to get there. And in fact, the technology only really landed with GPT 3.5. Well, GPT 3 was just about there, so about 2 years ago. But until then, we were too early on the insight.
Yep.
So where was it? Customer development interviews are actually the kind of crucial skill, because it is not just that talking to users, but really understanding what is behind it. So I'll give you an example where we had a sequence of product leaders who came in and they spoke to our users, and our users said they wanted grammar mode. So then they'd go and build a grammar mode. It's like, no, you are guilty of believing that they actually want a faster horse. Nobody wants a grammar mode. Like a grammar mode is literally could not be more boring. And sure enough, whenever they got built, no one would use the grammar mode. There's a interesting little uptick in conversion rate because people pay for something and they're like, oh, it's got a grammar mode. That's proper. I'll pay for that. Never going to use it because it sounds freaking dull, but I'll buy it. Which incidentally was Rosetta Stone's entire business model, was that people buy Rosetta Stone, they never use it, and then they recommend it to their friends. So we were a bit early, but then we, as the timing got right, we were able to then, and generative AI really has been the game changer that we've been waiting for. That allows us to, for example, take all the video content on the internet and turn that into language lessons. So if you want to understand, you listen to Maluma's new album and you want to understand the words in it, you can now just have a course automatically generated, which is what the generative AI can do for us. We've built that so that then you can learn a course specific to that. Ultimately, you want to watch a particular film in German, we can give you a course that just does that film and you watch it from beginning to end. You want to get good on your Spanish soap operas or Korean soap operas, courses for those. So that's an incredibly powerful thing, because people actually don't want to learn a language in the abstract. They want to learn it to do a particular thing. I needed to learn Chinese to run a motorcycle factory. So that's what I needed. None of the course books were going to tell me anything about how to say distributor cap in Chinese. But I needed to have that very context specific. And likewise, practicing conversation, clearly generative AI is a way, it allows us to create tools there that you can practice with in a way that had never been possible before. So that's really been the kind of renaissance for Memrise, is being another platform shift, getting into AI, generative AI before anyone else was there, and applying it in all these different ways. So we've really shifted Memrise from being a syllabus-based teaching company to being AI is runs through everything we do in terms of content generation and in terms of the way we're creating those user experiences.
Fascinating. It's got to be an exciting time at Memrise, given the fact that the vision that you've had, the technology has now evolved to make that even more possible. And everything.
Right. And by the way, that's such a huge dose of luck. Huge dose of luck. Like I've been excited by working with neural networks since the late 90s. And it just so happens that right now, we were definitely too early. Our timing was wrong. But 10 years into the Memrise journey, GPT-3 is released, and suddenly everything becomes possible. And we kind of hung around long enough to catch the wave, which is so much of starting a company, is like hanging around long enough, staying alive long enough so that when the wave comes, you're like, I'm in place.
You're there and you can capitalize on it. That's such an excellent point. I feel like that's another key takeaway here is people expect people like you and I, in terms of the products that we're building, to have a plan hammered out all the way through in terms of how we're going to get there. But a lot of it is keep going, right? Build yourself a sustainable path, be able to continue to keep going, and then take advantage of the opportunities that come at you from wherever. Just like this one. I've used the AI stuff that you guys are building in Memrise. It's fantastic. And it really does create much more of that immersive experience. Like I'm part of these conversations with people as they're talking about topics. And that's really a much better way to learn languages. I found out just myself personally from the things that I've done and how I've studied versus how they were teaching us back in school a million years ago as I was learning in the US, which was all like memorization based. And I could tell you probably 90+% of the people that had any of those classes with me or anybody else, at least in this country, probably doesn't remember the vast majority of anything that they learned then.
But if you look around the world, if you look at countries where people learn to speak English well, they're the countries where the TV is subtitled, not dubbed. If countries dub American TV, then no one learns to speak English. If they subtitle it, everyone does. And that is kind of depressing for language teachers, because you try your whole life teaching people, but actually probably like your Spanish lessons in school, if they had just spent their time getting you into Spanish soap operas and getting you to play Spanish computer games with your mates, then your Spanish would be pretty fluent. They just had to get out of the way.
It's fascinating. I do notice that quite a bit. I've learned, after I learned the basics, when I would watch videos and shows and stuff like that in the language I was learning, and it almost became a natural part of the process. So if you can get to that point where that isn't frustrating, it's so helpful. And Memrise does a great job of creating that experience for people from zero, which is really cool.
Yeah. It is that 0 to 0.25 that is
well said. I could talk about all of this with you forever because I find it super fascinating, especially given your background. I would love to talk a little bit more also about the work that you do now, because I believe you're doing some investing. You're helping early stage founders, particularly with product strategy. If you could talk to us a little bit about that, I think that would be amazing. I'm sure there's some listeners to this episode that have a million questions for you, but would love to know more about that. In particular, maybe
for sure,
who you work with and help, like what common mistakes that you are you finding when you're working with these early stage teams? What the best advice is you typically have for them, given the success that you've had?
Yeah, so things outside Memrise that I'm spending time on at the moment are like, so I've been doing more and more angel investing over the last 10 years, but particularly over the last 3 to 4 years. And then the last 2 to 3 years, really focusing in on climate tech is from an investment perspective. But I also, through an organization called One Day, which is really cool, sort of startup, where they have a startup MBA program, which I mentor on. And so it's kind of founders or people who wouldn't normally come into startups, because there is something, startups' dirty secret is quite what an exclusive or an elitist club it is. And the number of startup founders who are really self-made is depressingly few. And the level of, well, what that means is that for a lot of people, they just don't have that gateway into doing startups. They could do them really well. They could benefit. They could love the career and so much about the creative process of building a startup. But there needs to be something that gets you over that risk hump, and it gets you to just try it out. And either you have to just be the kind of overconfident person who's like, yeah, I'm going to work this out, which often comes with privilege and often comes from people who do have a financial safety net, and often comes from people who were brought up being told that they were able to do anything. And so one of the things that One Day is great for is giving this kind of guardrails or kind of stabilizers on a bike to get people who want to get into founding startups a way to do that, and take them through quite a structured process, helping them to do all the customer development, and having a mentor who has been through it all themselves multiple times there to be there. Like when things go wrong 50 times in a row, be like, yeah, no, that's cool. That's normal. That's not life telling you shouldn't do it. Like that's just the way it happens. This is going well, guys. Let's crack on. And also creating these little communities of like 5-6 people together who can help each other and give each other that kind of support as well. And so I spent a bunch of time in that. Really, my interest there is a lot working for, as I say, founder groups who wouldn't normally start founders. I'm very conscious that I'm a privileged white man starting doing my startup, and that is a position of privilege that needs to be kind of paid forward in some way. So anyway, that's what excites me there. Then there is the climate tech stuff, working with Carbon 13, that is like a venture builder for the climate emergency. And so it's working either with groups of founders who come together with not even an idea, just they want to do something to help the climate emergency, form into teams, and we help them work through that very early stage, and then invest in many of their ventures. Or it's people a little bit further along who've been working on an idea for a couple of years, probably haven't yet raised their pre-seed round, maybe a little bit of angel money, and getting them ready for that next round. So I spent a lot of time working with founders, both on the product strategy, but on then how to turn that into an investment case. And what I love about the investor position, what I love about taking investment, and we were talking before the call about bootstrapping versus taking VC investment. And I think what's fascinating about it is working out what is your strategy. What do you actually believe about how this opportunity needs to be built? And then what are the capital requirements for that? And then what do you need to prove in order to justify someone giving you the money to get out to the next stage and the next stage? And so I spent a lot of time working with founders on decks as well as working with founders on the strategy. They're kind of deeply intertwined in my view. And I think particularly in climate tech, there's a lot of times when VC is not going to work. Like it's VC is sort of broadly been mega successful in software, B2B software. And when you're looking for and consumer software. But when you're looking for the kinds of things that we need to do in climate tech, it often just doesn't look like a VC product. Like what one company I invested in and advised called Samudra, who make robots that can manage seaweed farms. And so seaweed is great for a whole load of food benefits. For production of alternative proteins can be done using seaweed. So taking surfing the wave of alternative proteins, reducing the need for beef and chopping down the rainforest, so on. But also carbon sequestration, blue carbon credits can come from seaweed. But the problem with seaweed farming is it's a really rotten job. You have to go out all year in the freezing cold on your little dinghy with a diesel engine, which belches carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, getting into really cold water to check on your seaweed and what needs to be done to optimize it. And it's just really hard to scale that in a meaningful way to meet the demand that we've got. But with robots, you can have the robots checking all of the nutrients, how you need to adjust all the settings, the depth at which your seaweed is, what nutrients need to be put in, and so on. And by doing that, so she's managed to create this product that she can then go to seaweed farms and say, look, I'll deploy my technology in your farm if you give me half your farm. And so they founded the company 9 months ago. 10 farms have so far said, yeah, I'll give you 50%. Let's go. It's that valuable to them. But trying to get VC money to invest in that, they're like, wait, this is a hardware business. That's going to cost a lot to scale. But I don't think that kind of fits. And that just doesn't work. Well, actually, my brother had another version of this. So he spent 10 years building sustainable power generation facilities. Then when electricity prices were really low in the UK, it's like, there's got to be something to do. A lot of the time, I just have a lot of free electricity. So what can I do with that free electricity? And they then set up this vertical farming business. So using the free electricity to run a vertical farm. And the economics of that are that vertical farming is like 50% of the cost is electricity. So if your electricity cost is zero, well, that's much better. Then there's actually another level that when you're running a vertical farm, you're generally optimizing to minimize electricity use. But if your electricity is free, you're just like, okay, well, if I've got as much as I want, what can we do now? Like, what is this? What do those algorithms look like? And what they found was they could get 60% higher yields than other vertical farms. That the output, they could get it to taste better because it's naturally organic. It's got no pesticides on it. Obviously, it's grown in controlled conditions. Therefore, you don't have to wash it. So it lasts on a supermarket shelf 3 weeks longer. Because the electricity is lower, the cost of producing it is actually lower than any other salad. They sell it at the same or a slightly higher price because otherwise people thought it was not a premium thing. It's like it wins all the taste tests. It tastes better than everyone else's. It's got a 3 week longer shelf life. So it's much cheaper for supermarkets logistically. And it costs less. I mean, this literally couldn't be a better business. Going around hundreds of VCs and universally they're like, yeah, I can't really invest in capital intensive stuff. You had to go to the US. Eventually got a US investor who put in like 5 million equity, 100 million of debt in a very non-typical VC round. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of creative thinking, certainly in climate tech. Actually, winding it all the way back, I think that the key piece there, though, in constructing the narrative and therefore constructing the strategy is understanding what is it that someone's got to believe in order for this to make sense as an investment. And first of all, me, because I'm investing my time as founder, what do I have to believe in order to put my time into this? And so for Joy at Samudra, it's like, what we're really pitching to investors is we've got a technology that allows us to buy 50% of seaweed farms for no cash injection. So if you invest in our company, you're getting this leverage thing where we can buy 50% of seaweed farms. As long as those seaweed farms are valuable, that makes sense. So what we need to prove to you as an investor is that the seaweed farms we're buying 50% of are valuable. So that now becomes the important thing. You don't need to know the details of how my tech works. Literally irrelevant. All you need to know is that I've spoken to 10 seaweed farms and all 10 of them have given me half. You don't need to know any more of that, investor. All you need to know is, if I buy a part of this vehicle, am I getting a share of that? But then from Joy's point of view, she's got to think, well, how much of this company am I prepared to sell to an investor? Because if I get half of 10 seaweed farms, but if in year 2 they're giving me substantial revenue, well, don't I want to just keep that all for myself? Like, why do I want an investor? And so I think you're getting to this by getting really clear on what your story is. You get really clear on, do I need investment to take this to the next level or not? And so with Memrise, our thesis at the beginning was that we needed, in fact, our thesis was, this is why it's so annoying that we didn't go out on mobile first. We knew that mobile was a platform shift and that we should get out there. We just thought we would build the MVP on web and then get it straight out on mobile. It just took us 4 years. Anyway, our thesis was, we need this to be free because people aren't yet in a pattern of buying things on mobile. So we need to raise enough money that we can run this company building a product for free for multiple years. Because by capturing this platform shift is how we are going to build real value in the long term. And the value is going to be in that network, in really having top spot on those app stores and sitting there, essentially what Duolingo did. And in order to do that, we needed to raise a lot of money. You can't bootstrap that. So that was our core belief about the market, or a market insight. And so we needed to raise VC money to do that. We actually needed to go to the US to do that because we knew that the UK market would not sustain that at the time. It might be it might be a little bit different now, but I think actually all VCs globally now are very revenue focused as well in the current climate. I'll pause there because I just rambled on.
I think that came all the way back. It's super fascinating. And I would say the lesson there for sure is putting that story together, right? Understanding all the pieces that you need to satisfy in order to make it go, right? Build yourself the path to success. And you gave 2 great examples. Climate tech, which is a lot of what you're working on and investing in now, which is very different from the SaaS that you built with Memrise. But regardless, figured out how to put all those pieces together to get from where you are here now to where you want to go. I think is very important, and a lot of people don't think about it that way, whether it's satisfying investors, whether it's satisfying customers, and what's going to build you a sustainable path to getting there. So I think those are excellent examples.
Also, people often think about pitch decks as trying to persuade investors. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if you're trying to persuade investors, that's totally wrong. You should just be telling them what you believe.
Just communicate.
And telling it in a really, like I tend to, anyway, with any founder, I break it back to a 10, 12 bullet point pitch, because you need to have the flow that simple that it's just like, this is the situation. Yeah. If you can't just read down the headlines and get it, you're not gonna persuade anyone.
Well said.
I guess another one that just jumped to mind. Yeah, I mean, we don't have enough time to dive into that, but I think there are really interesting processes with founders of the journey of how you go from a piece of technology. I like key thing. Actually, I will just say this. So one founder I've been working with for a couple of years, who had this amazing technology for sensing emotions, where they got hypersensitive sensors they built into headphones, and they could very accurately tell multiple different emotional states, much more accurately than any other tech. Started building this to be a kind of mental health wellness tool, and trying to get that, but found that they could show, after you look at Facebook or after you spend time on Instagram, your mental health goes down, like you're worse. So if you want to improve your mental health, maybe cut back on those things. Turns out very hard to get that message to resonate with users. What they found then was that actually there was an amazing resonance for product managers who were trying to develop products. Things like Spotify with their tuning music to your different emotions, or Memrise for us looking at things like when are we frustrating users?
Mm.
When are they actually getting really angry? When are they feeling good? What emotional states are related to conversion? So how do we know when to place conversion points where people do? And so they pivoted the whole business from this direct-to-consumer mental health app to this B2B SaaS product. It's called Kuo. Anyone who is looking to improve the metrics that you've got, or your understanding of users, it's kind of like having customer surveys, but on steroids, because customer surveys you can only put in at particular points, whereas this allows you to see the emotional journey of a user as they go through your product and
Very cool.
exactly where you can drop things in. So that's called Kuo, K-O-U-O, which I would highly recommend taking a look at.
Fascinating. Thank you for that as well, too. And thank you for being here, Ben, and sharing your knowledge and experience. It's very helpful. Myself, our audience, I have a million other questions, and we could talk about this forever. Perhaps another episode, though. But for now, besides thanking you, I was going to ask who should reach out and try to get in contact with you, and what would be the best way?
Yes, so I love talking to any founders looking to raise money at the early stage, really like angel round, pre-seed round, that kind of level. And particularly if you're into climate tech, that is my heartland.
Fantastic. Anywhere in particular we should
reach out over LinkedIn is probably
LinkedIn's best.
LinkedIn is the easiest. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Ben. Much appreciated.
Awesome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Product Launch. I hope you got value out of it. I like to feature product people on my podcast because that's who I love to help. I'm a product strategist, and I can help you scale your business and grow your profit through a product. If you'd like to learn more about how I can help you, email me at sean@nextstep.io. That's Sean, S-E-A-N, at nextstep, nxtstep.io. Or visit my website at nextstep.io. That's nxtstep.io.